Being a better dungeon master, Rule 3. The rules exist to resolve conflicts and add drama. They do not drive the story. This may seem a little bit more nebulous than most rules, and it is largely driven out of the experience of kind of a more of a meta discussion on what separates a board game from a role playing game, but this will hopefully make sense here as we go into this. Will be a very short one, not very terribly long. My apologies for the delay between the rules, but there's been a lot of other work that I had to get done and out of the way before I could come back to this one. So, basically, what do we mean by this? Well, we have rules in role playing games, and again, we go back to the cops and robbers, really to resolve conflicts. You know, when you're little kids and you're playing cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, things like that, and one kid says to the other, "I shot you," "No, you didn't." That's where the rules come from, is they really are sourced from kind of this idea of resolving a particular conflict. Otherwise, you really wouldn't need rules if there were no conflicts. If everybody agreed with everything, then it would be more like an interactive novel. Or if you're in theater, it's basically an entirely ad-libbed production. So part of that is to give, when you have a dungeon master or game master in general, the rules and the dice tend to give the players the illusion of chance. It's a buy-in. It's kind of a suspension of disbelief. The reality of a role-playing game adventure is it's actually deterministic. There's a story, and you've got all the stuff that the DM has planned out. And despite the concept of even like if you are a fan of JRPGs, where you have your players have these little random encounters along the road and things like that, even then the DM has to basically effectively choose to roll the dice. So there really isn't a lot of real randomness. Even in combat, players are making decisions about what actions they're going to take. The DM is deciding what actions they're going to take. The roll of the dice, then, in that sense, is to give, again, the illusion of chance, but also a sense of ownership of outcome. When a player rolls the combat dice and he misses, it's because he rolled the miss, not because the DM just simply told him that he missed. Even if the particular circumstances require the DM to make that call, it's still an illusion no matter what. So the dice really itself is a way to provide ownership of an outcome. So if that's the case, then making reactive dice rolls by the DM makes sense from earlier in the slide. If a trap door gives way and the DM rolls the saving throw for the player, and he can just simply says as the trap is sprung whether he succeeded or failed based off of a roll, that works a little bit better. Not to say that you can't let the player make that roll, but it's much more of a dynamic of you detect that there's a trap, and you're going to try to disarm or avoid the trap, and then letting the player make that roll, and then whether they succeed or fail works. In my experience, it works better if the DM makes a roll, because then it becomes a surprise. That way, because there's a disconnect. Remember, there's a disconnect between the character and the player knows a lot more than the character. By letting the DM do reactive dice rolls in that sense, it allows the DM to surprise the player and the character at the same time. So that works into that a little bit. And again, as we've already touched on, it's about ownership of those actions. So when the player is rolling the dice, they have ownership of the action. And they can see clearly, I rolled a 15. Did I hit? Yes. Okay. Now going forward, I know I roughly need to get a 14, around a 14. There's plenty of circumstances in combat where the DM can simply either add bonuses, subtract bonuses, depending on what the circumstances, the story, and how much drama you want to build up. I'm a firm believer in making every fight epic. I don't want cannon fodder. I don't want things that are dull and boring and uneventful. It's one of the few things I really dislike about the new Lord of the Rings films and The Hobbit and stuff like that, is a lot of times when you have these epic battles with these larger than life heroes, there's never any real sense of threat to the players. Legolas can shoot down 50 orcs, and they're making a game out of how many they've killed so far, and that really just strikes me as intensely boring. The players should always be taking a fight seriously. So if you need to drag out the fight a little bit longer to really convey that appropriately, then by all means give them, what do we say, the behind the screen bonus. So, but this also becomes very important when it comes to skills, feats, talents, spells, and things like that, where outcomes and choices may fall, which seemingly may fall to an earlier DM on a dice roll. And again, a good example is, do we save the girl? Well, with the party, that should always be a decision of the players, not some arbitrary dice roll based off of a spell or a skill. If you roll diplomacy and diplomacy says there would be a great amount of repercussions in attacking this noble, you're still not taking that choice away. But you would never say that the diplomacy roll would prevent that character from doing it. The player is inhabiting the character, and ultimately that decision needs to come from the player themselves. And a lot of times, newer players or less creative players and younger DMs will try to lean on skills as a crutch to make decisions. There's nothing wrong with giving people more information, but how you phrase that information is extremely important. So the game mechanics themselves should really never drive anything. Otherwise, you're playing a board game. And there's a real simple system, a lot of people call it auto DM, where everybody can be a player, and you kind of run the game like a board game. And if there's a great board game, and I believe it is called Touch of Evil. If you've played Touch of Evil, or like a lot of the Arkham games from the Cthulhu mythology, you understand how you can easily take the rules of D&D or any role-playing game system and turn them into a very simple board game. And what happens then, and that's what really largely separates an RPG from a board game, is that the board game is driven by dice rolls and is driven by the mechanics rather than being driven by player choices, which can be completely arbitrary. I mean, one of the greatest examples that the superiority of a role-playing game versus a board game is the board game or card game may have all sorts of rules for combat, may have all sorts of rules for just about everything, but it never has a rule for a player that says, I grab the lantern off the wall, smash it on the floor, and jump out the window. That's circumstances that come up, and there's just no rules for that for the particular board game. So you're always going to have a better and more superior, in my opinion, experience doing a role-playing game versus something like a board game. And again, going to the DM side of things, you really shouldn't be letting dice rolls make decisions for you either. You are both storyteller and narrator, and you really need to take a conscious choice. And let's say you have a branching story. One branch takes them to an abandoned barn, a day's travel out, where there's been suspicious activity where some of the evidence points to. Or there's a story point that comes to them sulking into a castle's dungeon to try to interrogate somebody that's in a cell. Ultimately, you want that choice to be between the players. However, if you've prepared several branches for varying difficulties, let's say they're struggling in the combat area, or your players are more interested in more investigative things like that, just choose. Don't flip a quarter. Because what you're doing is you're shortchanging your players your effort. And your players have taken time out of their day to sit down at your table and play a session with you. You really should not be just feeding them random gibberish. Even if it's prepared random gibberish, just make the choice. It's not hard. You're not being arbitrary by flipping a quarter or rolling a d6 on which branch they take. It's just being lazy. So you've built this narrative. You have this story that you're moving them through. So simply take control of that, take ownership of that, and make sure you're moving them in a very conscious way to react to their play style and what they're doing. When you're rolling a dice, that dice isn't taking into account what they've done, who they are and what they're doing. So, I mean, that's really all it boils down to. So, and it's all about ownership and empowerment of people and letting them really kind of develop the story and not letting dice develop the story. Otherwise, it's a choose your own adventure and you're just randomly picking entries, you know. This is not a game of Rogue. It's not a randomly generated dungeon with a randomly generated cast of creatures that has just an objective that seems to be consistent. So, again, there's better implementations of that if you want. Again, Torchlight on computer, you've got Diablo, you've got all these different family members of the Rogue genre that do it much better than pen and paper. So you have to really leverage the strength of what pen and paper role-playing brings. So, and again, we've covered these examples earlier. We're just putting them up here on the slide just so it's a little easier to reference back to. But again, branching stories. If there's a branching story, it should be dictated by players' decisions, not a dice roll. It empowers the players' choices. Don't steal that from them. Again, even if the simplest things, you know, if there's a hallway that has a trap in it and they can't disarm it, and there's a hallway that has a sealed door that they don't know what's on the other side of it, even that simple of a branch there should be dictated by a conscious choice, not some random dice roll of a skill or a talent or a feat or a spell. There are obviously always exceptions to the rule, but by and large, it should really be driven by player choices. Moral choices are a big one. Anything that's going to impact their alignment really needs to come from the player. You would never have a paladin risk his alignment based off of a random dice roll. It's not fair, first of all, and we don't have to be fair. I don't like the F word very much, but players should be in charge and have ownership of that. I even take that so far as to going that if there's a belt of reverse alignment, you know, that shouldn't be a randomly created piece of loot. You know, if you're going to put that into the story, fine, put it into the story. But by God, don't look up a treasure loot table and start doling crap out like that randomly. That's just, it's not appropriate. Even if it's a cursed item that they have to uncover, work that into the story. Don't leave it up to a random loot table. I hate random loot. I can't stand it. Yeah, I guess you could go into a big quantum physics discussion about the non-deterministic state of something until it's revealed or observed, and Schrodinger's cat and all that crap. That's fine and dandy, but reality is that if you're in a dungeon, what's been in there has been in there for quite a while. It didn't magically just appear out of nowhere. Get that stuff done ahead of time, and it should be relevant to the circumstances and surrounding. I can't count the number of bad campaigns I had to play where we would be in like a dank cave up to our knees in water, and one of the items that's loot it's a painting and 2 tapestries. They would have disintegrated and rotted decades ago. Nobody'd been in this cave system that we're in for the most part for like 100 years. No, and that's kind of the inconsistent crap that comes out of leaving your loot to a random dice table and rolls like that. So no, I just don't. Character motivation shouldn't be random either. The player is inhabiting the character, so the character really needs to work on bringing out that motivation. They should never be asking the question of the DM, is this something that my character would be interested in? If they ask that, your only response really should be I don't know, it's your character, you tell me. You know, but again, not beating a dead horse, the imagination bankruptcy issue is part of that, but they really need to take a serious amount of effort into breathing life into that character and giving that character motivations. It shouldn't be dice rolls that dictate the character's motivation. This is not when you're doing role-playing and you're doing role-playing well in a game session, it's not over the shoulder. It's first person. You're looking through your character's eyes, not over their shoulders, seeing what they do. You are that character in that context. You're not this disembodied entity looking over their shoulder like a game of World of Warcraft at your tune. You're supposed to be that character. So when people try to lean on dice to make decisions, that really over the long term tends to weaken a campaign in a group of players, not strengthen it. So, but that aside, they should always be able to use their skills that their character has to get more information necessary for them to make decisions. Not all of us are dragon slayers, so obviously we wouldn't necessarily know various things about a dragon. So our character does know things that we don't. And through skills, talents, feats, and a variety of mechanics that way, we should be able to give a player back the information necessary in the context that works to help them make that decision. But we should never make the decision for them based on those checks. So your diplomacy skill or your intimidate skill or any of those things should be tools really to give information back to the player so they can make the decision themselves, rather than have the mechanic make the decision for them. So hopefully that covers this topic. Again, I'll try to get on these as best as I can. This is going to be a very short one. It doesn't need to be very long. By and large, that should be about it. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I'll try to get more of them out. And again, don't take this as gospel. It is just my observations over the years. And if anything, just poke and prod you for some ideas and things to question rather than telling you what to do. Again, always go back to the first and most important rule, which is knowing your players and knowing what they want. So good luck, have fun, and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.